Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to part 5 of our continuing Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC webinar series. We are excited to provide some knowledge and some tools to help innovators, especially those non-traditional defense contractors, navigate the CMC program. I'm Chad Bryant from ATI, and I'd like to quickly cover just a few admin notes before we jump into the presentation. If you have any questions during today's webinar, I ask that you go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom link there and click the Q&A, please, instead of putting in the chat. That way we can more easily download those questions. So use your Q&A. All attendees are muted during the session. So if you do have a question, I ask you to use the Q&A function. The slides are going to be posted on the ATI CMMC webpage. I will provide that link in the chat here momentarily, so you have an opportunity to go on and see these slides later this afternoon. You will also have access to the recordings of the first 4 webinars. They're going to be available on that same ATI CMMC webpage. Well, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome back Derek White, Chief Product Officer and one of the founders of QuickTrack and Beryllium InfoSec. Derek, the floor is yours.
All right, Chad, thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody who has been with us so far through this webinar series, and welcome to those that are joining for the first time and or watching the recording or listening to the recording at a later date. And that will be important because as today is September 24th, some things might be changing here in the next few days or a few weeks. And so some of the information we cover today is going to be very, very relevant as we move forward. So today we're going to be joined by Fernando Machado, somebody who has a really extensive background. Fernando, thanks for joining. We're gonna get into some cool stuff. You guys can see his background here, but Fernando has been a good friend of ours for a while now, and has been through this ecosystem and journey of CMMC since before it was a thing. So Fernando, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Super. So we're going to do this. We're going to make this very conversational today. We're going to kind of do some back and forth on what we're going to get into. But first, we have a little housekeeping. So as Chad said, yes, please use the Q&A, not the chat. The link to that Chad reference will be on the end, and it will also be a QR code, and that will also be in the slides later. For all the previous webinars that we've done in this whole series and whatnot moving forward. So please use the Q&A, and then we can answer some of those questions afterwards too. We totally understand if someone has a question and they don't necessarily want to answer it here, then you can submit that through the email as well that's on the final slide. So stay tuned for that. So today we're going to get into a couple things. So we're going to start a little bit with just recapping for a slight few seconds on how we got here. We're going to talk about a very important rule update to CMMC. So we're going to have Fernando kind of walk through what that means. And then we're going to get into the assessment. That's just what we've built up to this conversation. Lots of questions here, lots of thoughts and opinions here on some of this stuff. Well, we're going to go through that. We'll explain that a little bit more on why we're going to go through it that way. And then we're going to talk about what happens after the assessment for CMMC happens and what that means to you, the contractor, and the listener. So first things first, how we got here. So as Chad mentioned, and as we've talked about throughout, we did this webinar series with ATI, and we're very grateful that the information and the guests we've had have been tremendous. But we did it in this order on purpose. If you've been on these before, you know that's a broken record comment from me and others. But you know, we did this in order so that we could get to where we are today, because the conversation is going to be more directed at those that can answer the specific question of, are you assessment ready? So we did what CMMC is about, where things are at, the data, and why the sensitive and scoping of data is important, different approaches, what the responsibility and legal side means, et cetera. That's great resource material on that link for you to reference back to for the foreseeable future. So a lot of that information really isn't going to change. But today, there are people probably saying, well, I'm not ready. And it's okay. This is still going to be fine. But for the sake of our little conversation back and forth with Fernando and myself, it's going to be for those that are answering yes. That's going to be the assumption that we're going to take moving forward. So first things first, before we get into what the assessment looks like today and how it's going to look from an OSC and a C3PAO perspective, and I'll explain what that means in a second. We're going to walk through a couple of the important nuggets from the CMMC proposed rule update. I'm going to kick this part over to Fernando and let you kind of walk through the specifics on what needs to be known now versus what people should be paying attention to here in the coming days, weeks, months.
Yep. Thanks, Derek. So first thing that we should know, right? Obviously, the rule was submitted back to OIRA earlier this year, and they completed their review on September 13th. So we should see the rule published in the Federal Register any day now. Just to kind of give you guys context, back last year, OIRA completed its review on November 21st, and we didn't see the rule published officially into the Federal Register until December 26th. So that kind of gives you that idea. So there's about 2 to 3 weeks there. Go ahead and on to the next slide, Derek. Yeah, so there's typically going to be, so once the rule is published in the Federal Register, there's typically a 60-day a 60-day period from the time that it's published to the time that it goes effective. And right, it could be 90 days, it could be longer, but usually what we've seen in the past, it's been about 60 days to that effective date. A couple of things to pay attention to the rule is that the phases begin in accordance with the effective 48 rule, right? Which currently has about another 21 days left on the public comments as of today. Ends around October 15th for the 48 rule. So once that goes final, the 48 rule goes final, the phase 1 rollout will begin. However, in the proposed rule, there is language that you got to be leery of that states, that the DoD at its discretion can require a level 2 certification instead of a level 2 self-assessment. So put your contracting officer hat on. What would give you greater assurance of your supply chain meeting compliance? Having them self-assess or having them go through a certification assessment? And I'll let you be the judge of that. Next slide.
Yeah, real quick before we get into the next thing, just to highlight, I know some of this is new to people too, but the confusing part a little bit is what Fernando just said, is there are 2 parts to this. There is a 48 CFR, there's a 32 CM. In layman's terms, one says CMMC is a real thing, the other thing says it can be in contract, has to be in contracts. And
correct.
There's other details that go beyond that, but to Fernando's point there, it's not going to go away. There are also rulemaking process, and there's also program process things that have to happen in order for the assessment, which we're going to talk about next, to be something that can be conducted and how it's going to go, et cetera. And there's still some updates to come on that, which we will talk about.
Yeah, and according to Matt Travis at the town hall last month in August, he said that once the 32 rule is final, the companies that are interested in getting a CMMC assessment can go ahead and get one at that point.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that a little bit too, because oddly enough, the next town hall is tonight. So we'll have a link to that on the final page here for people that are interested and have freedom to join something like that in the evening. You can check it, but they also post the recordings later. So we will have a link to that as well. So from here, I'm going to play a little bit more of the organization seeking certification, the contractor aspect. Fernando is going to play the certified third-party assessment organization. So if you haven't heard that term yet, that is what the C3PAO is. It's a very common word, and that is going to be the organization who then has the authority, who is authorized to conduct these assessments with people like Fernando, who are certified assessors. So from that aspect, before we even get into the assessment, put your I'm ready. So I answered yes to that question from before. I want to go find my Fernando. I want to go find my C3PAO. How are you going to do that? Now, this is very important because this is how you have to do that. You can't just go on Google and say, hey, find me somebody who can assess me. There's steps to this. And so the Cyber AB, the accreditation body, if that's another new term, then you can go to this website. This is their website, cyberab.org. You're going to find some resources on there. You're going to find some other areas that is specific to the accreditation body. So anything that's on that website is technically official information, not hearsay, not potential information. So in this step, I am ready. I'm ready to go get my assessment because, as Fernando just said, I can get it once this rulemaking stuff is finally final. You're going to go up here to the marketplace, and the marketplace is a resource that allows you to select different parts of the ecosystem that have registered with the Cyber AB, either as a certified or excuse me, an authorized C3PA, so a certifying organization who's a third party. There's other designations for ecosystem pieces like a registered practitioner and a CCA. You can go on there too and look for those. You're not necessarily required to work with the people with experience there. But the point here is you really want to pick people with experience. So when it comes to passing your assessment and getting in line with your assessment, you have the right to go interview as many as you want. You could pick 50 of them and say, I want 50 bids, I want 50 proposals on what my assessment's going to look like. Of course, they'll have questions for you on some things. We're going to get to some of that once the assessment starts. But you get to pick, and that is on purpose. That is over time. The market will figure itself out on how much this is going to cost based on what parameters. But C3PAOs are a wanted commodity, and Fernando's very busy. His team is very busy, but you want someone with experience here. So that's why they created this marketplace. So you're going to go here, you'll on the right, which you can't really see because we blurred it out. There's going to be C3PAOs that come up. You can pick them by region, you can pick them by whatever. Go there, interview, figure out what the cost is going to be. But again, do that when you're ready, because they're going to ask you questions right away. And then if they can tell you're not ready, then they don't have time to just throw quotes out there and pray that stuff comes in and put it on the schedule. So wanted to highlight that, cyberab.org. Make sure you access that when you are ready for your assessment. And even before then, lots of other resources on there that you can check out as well. So now we're going to get into the phases. Now, some of this will explain the differences in the details that lay today versus what's coming in the future potentially. But there are 4 phases to the assessment process. And of course, they are in order on purpose because we are in a certification from a third party pass or fail assessment world with CMMC, not a do it once a year, open some items and work on them, and I'm probably fine. Send your questionnaire onto your customer. That's not working. And so we're going to walk through these 4 phases individually, and Fernando's going to do a lot of the talking. I'm going to come at it a little bit more from the contractor side with some questions or what happens here so that everybody understands the importance of each phase. So first phase 1, and that's the plan and prepare assessment. I'm going to let Fernando here take over. Again, I'm going to pretend that I went to the marketplace. I looked at C3PAOs. I'm picking CyberSec Investments. I'm picking Fernando's company, and we are now agreed to do the assessment with him, starting with phase 1. Fernando, walk me through what I'm supposed to do at this point.
Yeah, so I want to go ahead and start off at right now. These phases are currently based on the current CMMC assessment process, or the CAP version 1.0, and it is subject to change. So we're going to go based on how the CAP is written today. So if you contact us, the first thing we're going to do before we even talk is get you a mutual NDA in place so that we can discuss your environment freely. Once we get that, we're going to set up a time for a call, and I'm going to want to know some things, right? I'm going to want to know a general description of your system and tell me a little bit about your organization. That matters because how we assess a manufacturing environment might be completely different on how we assess a software development environment. I'm going to ask things like, when was the last time you updated your system security plan, right? That is going to tell me if you've been keeping up with this document. The SSP is a living document. I'm going to ask about the assessment locations that are going to be in scope, right? Could it be 1 location? Could it be 2? Which locations are going to be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI? Will you be printing or handling paper CUI? What about removable media that contains CUI for some of you manufacturing environments? And if so, how is that securely stored and destroyed? I'm going to be asking about, will you be hosting an on-prem server that contains CUI? What about external cloud service providers, right? Will you be using an external cloud service provider to process, store, or transmit CUI? If so, is that cloud service provider at least FedRAMP moderate or equivalent and complying with paragraph C through G in accordance with DFAR 7012? Are you using a managed service provider? Do you have a customer or shared responsibility matrix in place that shows what you're responsible for and what your external service providers are responsible for? Are you backing up CUI? If so, where are you backing that CUI to? And so once we kind of go over those questions and we start to get those answers, it's going to start to really give me a clear understanding and a starting point to understand your environment, which leads to our next slide. But I wanted to see if Derek had any questions here.
Yeah, I mean, from this point, thank you for laying this out. That this is sort of what we've been building to. So, you know, if I put my contractor hat on, I would say I'm ready to show you all this, Fernando, because I went to these ATI webinar series and they were amazing, and I got all the information that I needed and I prepared. That's why I said I'm ready for my assessment. We're going to get into what happens a little bit if some of that's not clear or whatever. We're going to talk about that. But yes, that is the whole point of this. Is they're going to ask you that stuff first, because they can't just throw darts at a wall or just assume that everything's great and honky-dory, we're going to go, here we go. That stuff's very, very important, which is why we put so much emphasis on pretty much every single one of those things in that order on the previous webinar. So please check those out if you haven't seen those yet. All right, on to the next section.
Yep. So here we're going to verify the readiness to conduct the assessment, right? So there's going to be one of 4 possible outcomes that will happen, right? We'll either, 1, proceed with the assessment, which means that I looked at everything at a very high level, not determining if anything is good or not, just looking at everything at a high level, making sure that all the stuff is there. And I say, okay, we can move forward. The next step downgraded from that is replanning the assessment. There may be some discrepancies that we found during that readiness review. Then the next step is rescheduling the assessment. Sometimes there may be issues that come up, such as like a death in the family, or, you know, here in Florida, right, we have natural disasters. So it's going to cut out a lot of power and potential internet connectivity and so forth. So that may require rescheduling. And then last but not least, we may cancel the assessment, meaning we're not planning on moving forward. We won't even get started with you.
And not technically a failed assessment, just we're right. Or I guess it's one of those things where it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you guys get to that point and all of a sudden they're talking about a server that wasn't in the documentation, whatever that stuff you ask them the questions, and you're just getting that feel of it, we can't get going through an assessment that halfway through you're not going to be ready. I mean, technically you can, and hopefully that's what this whole phase is for. But is this considered a failed assessment for me here, or is this considered I'm not ready, I need to get my ducks in a row and come back and reschedule, not reschedule, but go through the process with you?
This is you're not ready, come back and see us in 3 months.
Okay. Gotcha. And thank you for saying 3 months, because the zoo that is now the CMMC rulemaking process as that goes is that scheduling time with an authorized C3PAO. Just a warning here, which if you're reading anything on LinkedIn or Google, is not tomorrow. So you're not going to be able to just say, hey, C3PAO, let's start this on Monday. We're set and ready and we're hungry. We want to get this. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here as we move on. But just know that the readiness stuff that you keep hearing about, the preparing, the gathering, which we're going to talk about, is so that we can stay away from the right side of this chart and obviously proceed with the green with the assessment. All right, so that's phase 1. We're going to move into phase 2. We went with the green, so we are proceeding. And thank you, because I'm prepared and I have all my stuff. Let's go. Walk us through now what happens for the conducting of the assessment.
Yep. So right before we get to that conducting the assessment part, we're going to ask to send us your evidence, right? So everything from your policies, procedures, system security plan, artifacts, even screenshots if you have them for your environment. We put together a OneNote editable document that we call the Assessor's Playbook that has all of the control domains and each control for your upload, and organize that evidence in one central location so that you could zip it up and send it to us. And you can download that for free on our website, and I've enclosed a link there for everybody to get a copy of that.
Yeah, and this will be a live link for the slides at the end as well once those are posted. So that is a live link, and very good tool. Again, free resources. We're all about that. That's been the story of this webinar series. So thank you, Fernando, for pointing that out so we can include
Absolutely.
this. So I have all of my I have my evidence. I've got my documentation. I've got it all collected. Sometimes tell me Do you see things that are not collected very well? You can kind of see it spread all over the place, yeah, does this, if my stuff's all over the place, it's somewhere, but it's hard to find. Are we stopping and pausing, or are we just gonna take whatever time it takes?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to ask, like, if there's anything that I can give anybody a piece of advice on, is try to have some type of document traceability matrix to let us know where things are at. That helps cut down on a lot of time of your assessment. Potentially, depending on the C3PO that you talk to, you may get billed by the hour. And if they have to sift through documentation, that can quickly add up for you.
Yep. Good rule of thumb there is pretend like the internet doesn't exist. Put all your documents in a binder and then sort it the same way, which is exactly how you would do it, as this policy, this procedure set, this mapability, and put it into some sort of traceability, whether it's a spreadsheet or a Word doc or something where you can link right to that file and that evidence. So, yep. Okay, so from phase 2, I've gathered all that. I've used your playbook. Hallelujah. Here we go. Now we're going to get into more of the what happens after you have all that stuff. So walk us through this a little bit on what this means to me and my organization.
Yeah. So when you're going through your assessment, your C3PAO, the lead assessor, is going to go through what's called potential assessment methods and objects for each of your assessment objectives, right? So first, they can either examine, right? So the process of reviewing, inspecting, observing, studying, or analyzing assessment objectives, right? So these are going to be things that they're going to examine, things like your policies, your procedures, any work instructions, and configurations during live demonstrations. The next potential assessment method and object is interviewing, right? So interviewing your subject matter experts and personnel with those domain responsibilities to get an understanding of your system. And then lastly, they can do testing, and testing can be things like, hey, you explained to us that these 3 individuals are the only ones that have access to this door. I'd like to ask Johnny from the shop floor to attempt to badge into the door. And if he's denied, it's going to demonstrate to me that the control is operating as intended and producing the desired outcome. Now, that is not to say that the assessor has to use every single potential assessment method and object for every single assessment objective, but rather the assessor has the flexibility to determine the level of effort that's needed for the assessment.
And when they first rolled this out, I'll put my role-playing hat on here. I remember reading, Fernando, that you need to provide. And so let me back up real quick here. So there's 320 assessment objectives. We covered that in the last webinar and even the one before that make up the 110 controls of NIST standard 171. The assessment that we're talking about today is obviously CMMC level 2. So this is not going to be on a level 1 perspective right now. We're looking at this from those that are subject to handling, storing, processing CY. So originally it says 2 out of the 3 forms of objective evidence need to be provided. And some could say, well, cool, then I'll just do the exam and interview portion. I don't have to have the test. That's 2 out of 3. But technically, the assessor, if I heard you right there, gets to decide which 2 they look at. And so you are better off having all 3 ready. And to your
Correct.
point, role playing here. Okay, well, I said that John's responsible for this and Susie's responsible for that. In my documentation, you read that, you interview John, and he doesn't answer as well, and Susie answers perfectly. And then all of a sudden you go to testing, but John passes the test portion where you see him do it. Where does that fall on my assessment just happened? It's really, really good. I did show 2 out of the 3, although you kind of looked at 3. Is that going to be a red or a green situation there?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends, right? We know that sometimes during the course of an assessment, people get nervous and may not say something or may forget. I mean, you remember there's 320 assessment objectives, and even for some small companies, having to locate a lot of this stuff can be a little bit nerve-wracking when you're put on the spot. So it really depends on your assessor. This is why interviewing your C3PAO is paramount to know kind of like where they stand.
Yep, agreed. And so and again, if you're not prepared to be examined of your documentation and interviewed and, test what you're doing in those things, then you're not ready. That's yep. The overlying message here is make sure that you are preparing those. That's why internal good mock audits, we're using a consulting firm that maybe you're working with on a regular basis, or whoever your internal resource is pick some some areas and see how you do. And if you wake up with cold sweats because you don't feel like it went very well, then we're going to talk a little bit about that too in a couple slides here. So, okay, so phase 2, moving on here to the final portion of phase 2. Walk us through what that looks like.
Right. So according to the proposed rule, there are 2 types of certification that you can achieve, right? So you have conditional certification and you have final certification. So first, in order to achieve conditional certification, each of these things have to be met. So 1, your assessment has to be at least 80% or higher. 2, no 3 or 5 valued controls can be POAM'd. And lastly, 3, none of these subset controls here can also be POAM'd. So if you meet all of these criteria here, you will achieve conditional certification.
So just to re-highlight, because we don't want to spend a ton of time going back in time with the previous webinars, but we do walk through the CMMC DoD assessment methodology on what a 5-point, 3-point, and 1-point control means and how that applies to the assessment objectives. So 5 is bigger risk, bigger impact. You know, that's why they're valued at 5 versus something that's valued at 1. So
Correct.
What you're saying here, Fernando, if I think I heard you right, as I've studied all this because I'm ready, is that some of the 1 level or one value pointed things I can have not quite done and tighten up later, but not the 5.1s and then within these control families here these controls
Correct.
here that you're laying out, correct?
Yep. Yeah. The 3 and the 5 valued controls cannot be POAM'd.
Yep.
Those have to be at a minimum. They have to be implemented in order for you to achieve conditional certification.
Okay. And that last bullet there about closing out POAM items, can you just touch on that again real quick for me?
Yep. So at the end of your assessment, once you get your score, there'll be some POAM items that'll be available for you to fix. And at the close of your assessment, the company will have 180 days of the initial assessment to close those POAMs out and have a C3PAO come out to close them out. And it could either be the C3PAO that you initially engaged with, or it could be another C3PAO to come out and do the POAM closeout.
And it'd be the items that were on the POAM, not a full assessment from the start to finish again?
No, absolutely not. No. So it's basically a delta assessment. It's only for the items that were deemed to be not met. And those are the ones that will be reassessed.
Got it. Awesome. Okay. And in the POAM world, that's helpful because if it is so totally missed, didn't have hardly anything to show, is a different plan of action and milestone to get that done than somebody who, was nervous and didn't answer the question, or maybe didn't click the right buttons on what they were demonstrating. So, okay, so that's phase 2, halfway home. Moving on to the phase 3 of the assessment. And Fernando, from your side, okay, we've gotten through all this stuff. I finished up my POAMs on these couple things that I missed. What happens from here?
Yeah, so from here, once the assessment's complete, the C3PAO will upload the results into the CMMC EMAS. Things that your C3PAO is going to include in the upload is going to be the final report of the detailed practices and score, and the reports have to be uploaded to EMAS no later than 20 days from the final findings briefing.
Yep. And at this case, in my position, you're doing that. Do you provide updates? Is there somewhere I can go to look? Do we know that yet exactly how that's going to go?
We currently don't know that at the moment. I don't have access to the CMMC EMAS just yet. I think that's still in the works, but that is what it will be in the future.
Yep. I asked that because that is one of the questions that we get is how long it's going to take. And some of that stuff is still being worked out. It's also not up to Fernando and the C3PAOs to decide that. So just know that that is expected to be cleared up here in the very near future. Okay. So stuff gets, you did that for us. Great. Thank you very much. You're going through, and now we're going on to phase 4, which is, if necessary, some of this, again, subject to change, but now here I am on closing out POAMs while you're doing some of that stuff. Walk me through this a little bit.
Yeah. So this is basically what we talked about just a few minutes ago, right? That you can select either the original C3PAO that conducted your assessment to conduct your POAM closeout, or you can find another C3PO to perform your POAM closeout. And a lot of you are probably wondering, why would you switch a C3PAO to do another C3PO to do your POAM closeout? And it could be that they simply don't have the time to come back, right? And so you may have to, if there are any POAMs found, you may be left with no option but to having another C3PO to come in and do that Delta assessment to do your POAM closeout for you.
Yep. And just so people do understand what a C3PAO is signing up for, there are code of ethics. There are documents that you sign with the Cyber AB that says, I'm going to do this the way it's supposed to be done, going to use, true ethics to it. There won't be, so let's just say they use non-Fernando and they go to another organization that doesn't have you at the helm, and they went and paid and got registered and got authorized, and they're a C3PO, and they don't that. The Cyber AB, correct me if I'm wrong, can remove them as an authorized C3PAO, correct?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, we're all bound by the Code of Professional Conduct, that we maintain the highest integrity when conducting assessments.
And I'd like to highlight that that's important because there are organizations who specialize in auditing and assessing for multiple cybersecurity frameworks, not just CMMC. The ecosystem of C3PAOs and those that are developing these requirements want people to pass. They want organizations to get this done and get this in place. This is not a show up to your door without being announced and try to catch you and ha gotchas. That's what the mock assessment's for. That's what the internal work and using external parties in the prior to the assessment projects are for, is to see where your gaps are, see that you're very confident in some areas and maybe you're not. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But I just wanted to highlight that C3PAOs don't just get to go do handshakes under the table and say, hey, I'll pass you and give me a cut of that. That's the code of ethics stuff that will end up in a very, very bad situation if they go into business as a C3PAO to do that kind of stuff. They want to show up and see efficient assessment prep to get in, get you passed. Obviously, it has to be right, and move on to the next project. And that's the more we get to that, the better this whole program is going to be as time goes on, the dust settles, etc. So lots to go before that happens. Still with some updates coming from the DoD. So from here, the assessment's over, and we are going to leave quite a bit of time for questions. So I want to go through a couple things quick here. So taking all the role-playing hats off here, now we're going to talk a little bit about what to do after the assessment. Fernando and his team take the results, they upload them. Either while you're waiting for the results, which you should have a pretty good idea about, but waiting for certain things to happen. This is always a good debrief plan internally, is to see how it went. And we do a lot of this debriefing, have for years. This is cybersecurity, bank audits, all these other types of audits. This is a really good thing to do. Is how did it go? Maybe you passed the flying colors, great. Maybe some areas could have been more efficient, even though you passed, but maybe you didn't pass. And why didn't you pass? And where did things fall apart somewhere, or where did things get overlooked? Some people are going to be up against the gun. Not that's an undeniable situation that some people are trying to time this just right. They're trying to wait and see. If that's your case, I mean, you are really up against a short window of time, but the event that somebody asks you for it when you need it and you're not ready for it, now is the time to be thinking about that stuff. But you are going to get to a post-assessment, postpartum, if you will, to the point where, what do you do? And then that's where you want to make the appropriate changes. And it doesn't have to be anything super negative, but maybe it's too much for Susie and Mark for what they were responsible for. And all of a sudden they're like, man, if I got to do this all the time and stay compliant, like maybe we need to add a body, maybe we need to add a resource, maybe we need to implement some different tools differently, because it was too much time during our assessment, which does cost more time, which costs more money to get through that. But more importantly, what happens on the positive side when you pass? So this is something that Fernando and I talked about. We've talked about this a few times, but right now there are currently scenarios where you can we talked about this last week or last time too, called joint surveillance assessments, where you can voluntarily go through joint surveillance. Fernando's team has been on a ton of these, and that was a program to sort of test out with DCMA's DIBCAC assessment team and C3POs together, For those that answered yes to the question, I'm ready and I have everything gathered and I want to go through this and then get credit for it once this thing becomes, with CMMC becomes a thing. And we've seen some, some really good things from that. We've seen some interesting things. We probably haven't heard of some of the responses to when maybe people didn't pass, but we want to talk about the importance of what shifting your mindset to keeping it there. There are going to be companies who get past the assessment. They're happy to be level 2 CMMC certified, which again is just a certification assessment of NIST standard 171 at the end of the day. And that's a great thing for their salespeople, great thing for leadership to say that we have that, but you can't fall out of compliance. So you can't dust it off in a year or 2 years because your certification technically holds true and good standing for 3 years. This isn't a 2.5 year down the road. Make sure everything's still in shape. There's requirements that keep your compliance in place within NIST standard 171 and now CMMC to a self-attest, for example, that you leadership says we're still here. We haven't made changes, but we know things are going to change. So we have an example here. There's a couple different things that can change your business model on passing your assessment. It's going to give you, if you're one of the early adopters to this, you're going to be in a different playing field. You're going to have some competitive advantages, no question, against some of your competitors who don't have it yet. But you're also going to be on the radar for some other things. Maybe you're going to end up with projects you weren't planning on even being a part of the bidding process for. Maybe you get to expand your operation now, and that's going to change your scope. That's going to change what infrastructure and who's accessing where the COI data is and who wasn't in scope before. Maybe you end up in an acquisition situation where you merge with another company, and now that location over here has COI, so do you, and now you got to figure out how those communications are going to talk and how that changes your scope. So Fernando, I want to ask you the question here, and I'll put my hat back on here. My company passed. Thank you very much. That was great. But we're going to go in and get another $30 million project. It's going to make us add 17 more people to our company. Our infrastructure is going to change. Before we talk about a really cool example of what happens when you do this and what your customers are going to think of you, what happens in that scenario, even if there's some gray, but like what happens in that scenario to me to keep my standing of certified at level 2 as I make some changes?
Yeah. So currently, right, we can only go based on what's in the proposed rule at the moment. And here you can see it that if that scope changes due to infrastructure modifications or expansion of the scope due to new acquisition, then a new assessment may be required. The original CMMC certification will remain valid, but those new information systems, those new components, cannot process, store, transmit CUI until they've been validated via a new assessment. So we asked during the comment period, what do they mean by infrastructure modifications, right? Is it going from Windows 10 to Windows 11? Or, right, I come from an 853 RMF background. It would be something adding like what's called a security relevant change. Your boundary had Windows 11 devices, and that's what's certified. So you can add as many devices as you want. But the moment you add, say, like a Linux server, now that Linux server component has to get assessed and then added to the overall boundary later. Now, we asked the DoD to clarify in the comment period what they mean by that. At the moment, we have no idea. We only have based on what is written here. The best we can tell you is make sure that you're keeping up with your change management, making sure you're keeping up with your hardware and software inventory until we get clearer guidance from the DoD.
Yeah, rule of thumbs there is it's risk-based approach. So, be smart about any changes that you're going to make. If you're able to use tools that have an inheritance that can be proven, that will help with your changes, et cetera. Then we talked about that with external providers, but that's where expertise comes into play. You can work with people that can help you with that, so you're ready for the moment. The worst thing that can happen is that you make changes. You didn't assess yourself before the changes. You didn't reassess any implementation documentation updates, and then you can't prove that you made changes. Now you can't really tell them exactly where CUI is potentially, even though they might be able to answer questions or might be able to show with documentation. But if you can't show it and prove it, that's the bad things. That's the stuff where self-attestation was not working because they were asking questions and all of a sudden the answers are, well, you can't tell me that CUI didn't walk out the door. So fix that kind of stuff. So a really cool story that is worth bringing up, and I'll let you, Fernando, talk about this, is an example of something that happened when somebody went through and passed their joint surveillance assessment.
Yep. So we were brought this client by a trusted client in the ecosystem, and she did a great job at getting this company set up. And we assessed them in December of last year, and they ended up passing with a perfect 110. Very small company, I believe they were under 10 employees. And when it was all said and done, I believe that January they were notified by Northrop Grumman, making them supplier of the year. They accepted the award, and I think they were rewarded with contracts because of their willingness to lean forward with the Joint Surveillance Program.
And essentially demonstrate confidence to Northrop that they're not going to be a problem in a break in the chain, if you will, once that happens. That
Correct.
link on here again will be active. This is a screenshot from LinkedIn. This is from Jayco Aerospace's actual announcement, but that link down there is the press release from Northrop Grumman that will be available to you once you have the slides. So really cool. Check that out. Kind of fun little positive story on what happens when you're ready and you prepare and you pass. Lastly, we talked about this. So the link here is also live from the AB's website, the Cyber AB's website, to all of the past town hall recordings, including the August one that Fernando mentioned. But again, tonight, I think it's at 6 o'clock Central or 5 o'clock Central.
Eastern.
6 p.m. Eastern. The September town hall is going to be live, and then there will be a recording posted shortly after. So if you can't make it tonight, you can watch it later. But expecting, hoping, praying that there's some updates to some things that we're looking for. So always a good resource. Again, if it's coming from the AB, then that's about as best of information as you can get, besides maybe being misled by some people out in the wild. Okay, so we have 18 or so minutes here. This is the final slide, which we always have up. So just to re-hit on some of this before we jump into some of the Q&A, because I see some coming in. If you got questions that you want answered later, cmmc.info@ati.org. Feel free to fire over there. Same with us. You can send us some emails here at Beryllium at info@berylliuminfosec.com. We will answer them to the best of our ability, or point you in the right direction of the resources like Fernando and others to do that. Fernando, I'm sorry, last thing, QR code here, if you want to scan that, that'll bring you right to the live website link that ATI has put together, which has all of the previous recordings plus this one once it's ready, and the slides. Again, this will be a great resource for the time being, for quite a while, on what to go back to if something isn't making sense and you knew that you heard it somewhere within this series. Go back and do that, and look for some announcements on some future stuff too that we're working on with ATI. But Fernando, how do people get a hold of you before we get into Q&A?
Yep. So there's two ways to get a hold of us. They can call our phone number at our office at 800-960-8802, or they can email us at info@cybersecinvestments.com.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to rip through some of these questions. So thank you for submitting questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Obviously, if they're a little too specific, maybe to the person asking the question, then we may answer that privately offline, just so that it doesn't deter anybody else's thoughts. So okay, so and again, the huge clarification one more time, disclaimer that some of this is as it's written today. Not sure if updates will be coming. I think we can expect some places, but maybe not in some others. But first question, when will MSPs that are seeking CMMC certification be issued provisional cage codes?
I have no idea.
That's going to be on the DoD, but that is a question.
Yeah.
I wanted to highlight the fact that is a really good question.
It's a very good question.
Might even be something that they'll touch on in a town hall either this, well, maybe not tonight because the rule hasn't been totally laid out yet, but that's a good question. And stay tuned to the DoD releases for that. And then when that comes out and that's official, you're going to see a ton of information on how that's possible. So that's a good one. So this is a good question. This is a good question here, and a little bit more of a comment too. But doesn't the DoD need to give the DIB enough time to certification before they require it in contracts? So yeah, go ahead and answer that one. I got obviously an answer on that one too, but
So there are two in reality. When you're really looking at this, there are really two rollouts here, right? You've got the rollout by DoD when the 48 rule is final, but then you have the hidden rollout, which is by all of the primes, right? The Lockheeds, the Raytheons, and the Boeings. Once that 32 rule goes live, there is nothing stopping those large companies from turning to their supply chain and saying, CMMC is out, go get a CMMC cert. You work for me, not for DoD. So the DoD may give you enough time to go get a certification. Your prime, however, may not.
Yeah, and that's, I wouldn't say that that's probably the best approach by a prime, just to say, hey, Fernando and Derek, you guys better have your stuff done. But because if you don't, then do they have other options? That's one thing, right? Do they want to go back out to bid? Is it a fixed, that's another thing too. Is it a contract that you're currently in, or is it new contracts? I mean, it's going to be
Correct.
That's going to play itself out. The DoD stance on this, by the way, is going to be, well, the requirements say you have the DFAR 7012 clause in 19 and 20, and you have had those contracts, you should have this stuff done. The cost of a certification and the process to get certified is not their control anymore, but that shouldn't be that hard for you, blah, blah, blah. I know that goes a little bit easier than saying, but hence the reason the DoD is, in their mind, has given you plenty of time. If you are a holder, it's the organizations that don't have CUI yet or haven't gone after those contracts yet that want to chase CMMC level 2 contracts. I can get a little bit of this how to do it right, and you're not going to end up in a false claims act because you don't handle CUI. But if you want to, then yeah, you're gonna have to get certified first. That can get a little tricky, but that's where our previous webinars focused on scope, contracts, making sure that you can implement a strategy that works for you and then scale up from there as your awards come to you. But we're not even going to touch on the external provider side yet, because they haven't fully released clarity on exactly what happens on if you're using someone, how do they get certified before you do, if they don't have a cage code or they don't have certain things. So that's still closer to being done, but not fully clear yet. But good question. Just want to make sure that we do answer as many as we can here. Okay. We talked about this. I think we answered this one. So how long OSCs have to close out their POAMs before C3POs reassess. So we talked about that.
Yep.
So we answered that live.
180 days.
180 days, yes. Okay, so we have one question here about how they specifically handle things in the cloud and what's in scope, out of scope. We're going to answer that one offline. It came in from an anonymous attendee, but we can have that one sent out to everyone who registered as an answer that we can give, but it's not going to come off as what you should do, because you're getting really into kind of some technical differences on no CUI, et cetera. Okay, how do we handle an item that would be in a POAM but is done / handled by a managed service provider, i.e. their service provider is working on a new solution for one of the controls, but we have no control over the implementation and timeline. So let's say scenario here is we know we have a gap. Our MSP is managing that for us. Our managed service provider is managing that for us. Also, and there were some updates to things like the FedRAMP memo and some other areas where MSPs and other technology providers had to do more due diligence and maybe some replacement of product and tools and services and such. But I don't have control over that because I'm using my MSP. I guess I would answer this one is they should have a timeline. They should have a plan of action themselves on how that's going to impact their service to you and the costs and timelines and how it's going to be managed and what you inherit from them. If that timeline is 24 months from now, I would have some questions. But if it's, 6 months, 3 months, if you're in a hurry to go get your CMMC level 2 certification, that could cause some issues. But if you have time before it's in your contracts and you can get certified, then just ask them what their timeline is on it. I don't have it. There's not really a good answer on, but from my perspective, I don't want to overstep my bounds here. But Fernando, what are your thoughts on situations where your MSP is trying to do the right thing? They've been in a position where they got to make some changes too.
Yeah, I don't know what the guidance is right now. I do know that, so there's a neat tool that is out there. I recommend everybody go check it out. It's called the DoD Procurement Toolbox. And under the cybersecurity FAQs, under the question 7, it talks about if our company outsources their IT to a third-party contractor, are they still responsible with complying with 7012 and implementing 800-171? And DoD's response there is outsourcing your IT to another company doesn't transfer your DFARS 7012 responsibilities or 800-171 requirements. And they go on to say that if your IT service support is deemed to be less than or non-compliant with the contract, the company contracting with the DoD is ultimately going to be held responsible. So that's pretty much the only guidance that's out there right now. We'll know more as the rule comes out. Again, there's a lot of questions regarding external service providers that have yet to be answered.
And that comes down to scope. So if we're talking in that question, we're talking about one of the controls that's being implemented from your MSP is processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, then that tool that they're implementing or whatever they're going to be doing has requirements that it has to meet. You know, they can't just use anything off the shelf. So tough, good question. Tough, a little bit tough one to answer, but right now you technically would have time because you're not going to be getting certified in the next couple of weeks. So just stay on top of them, see what their updates are. And, you know, if it time gets a little tighter, then maybe you have put a plan in place, or maybe you have to make some changes. It's hard to say. Let's see here. How much of a change in business requires you to say on an annual certification something is different? Can you give examples of what makes you no longer compliant and what does not? So we kind of answered that. It must have come in probably right when we were done talking about that. You use the physical location scenario where, all right, maybe I did, doesn't matter. That's one of the more common ones we see is a company has their ducks in a row. They make an acquisition, and this a lot of times is usually in the manufacturing engineering space. It's kind of coming together is then all of a sudden they acquired a company that really didn't know exactly where their CUI was, and now they've just inherited this mess of a location or two that have CUI on-prem within their systems. Now they have ITAR on something maybe that has to be shipped, I mean, or whatever. That's one of the examples that we use. Anything else to share there, Fernando, on other examples of things that can go from good standing to make changes to now, I wouldn't pass my certification today because I got to make these changes. What kind of leeway are they going to have? I know we don't know the exact answer to that yet, but anything else?
I don't know. No, I mean, and based on what I said earlier, right? Like coming from an RMF background, we used to always go by the term, right? The security relevant change. So if your certification boundary is a bunch of Windows 11 laptops and you get certified with that boundary, adding something else completely different, i.e. a Linux server, that could potentially trigger a new assessment for that component. Yeah. But until the rule comes out, and hopefully they address those comments that were made, because I know there were plenty of comments regarding that. We currently don't know right now.
Yep. Now this next question also came in from somebody anonymous. I'm going to stay away from the answer to this next one, but I will highly recommend that you go on LinkedIn and search your question, or at least something to do with Chevron and the DoD, to see legal answers from people that are on the legal side that have put their opinion out, although not legal advice, but legal opinion, because it's a little confusing. But do you expect the recent decision on the Supreme Court on the Chevron related situation to have any impact on CMMC, and will the DoD be challenged based on this decision? I'm not touching this one. It's not my expertise level.
Yep.
I would say go to LinkedIn.
Not an attorney.
I don't even want to name the people that I want you to go look at, but there are really, really good individuals out there who have a lot to say about this. I would read through that and then maybe draw your own conclusions for now until there's more details available.
Yep.
Okay, so here's a good one. What do we got here? 5 minutes. How does remote work affect the assessment? So in this case, it looks like software development company that has access to CUI documents and software on the laptops they take home.
Yeah, you're allowed to have it, right? I don't want to throw out cloud service providers out there, but very good cloud service providers out there that are compliant, right? You'll be able to initiate things like mobile device management over that endpoint so that the organization has complete control over it, making sure that encryption is turned on both at rest and in transit. And you can take that laptop pretty much with you anywhere you like, and just making sure that no unauthorized people are in the area observing the CUI documents and software on those laptops or overhearing any type of discussions that you may be having as well. So as far as remote work goes, it really doesn't have much of an effect as long as you've implemented the requirements, like, mobile device management, making sure that certain things are in place, and that should not be a problem.
Yep. Good. Okay, I got one more for sure here. I want to rip through a couple we can't answer. And this is another popular one. What level does service provider need to be compliant with for CMMC if what the OSC buys and uses in our network has access to control? So scope is everything. So if CUI in your contract, I mean, again, back to the beginning of this webinar series, contract language, scope, identification, if they're touching it, tools they're using touching it, they support your devices, and that stuff has CUI, it has to have the controls on it. So,
yep.
Like Fernando just said, if the device if you can take CUI onto your device and that device doesn't have the controls, isn't encrypted, doesn't meet the fit, doesn't have the stuff it needs to have, it's a CUI asset. So that has to be in scope, that it's going to be assessed. You can pass an assessment with that device pulling stuff down. And then that comes down to what can the device do and can't do? Can it connect to external drives and external networks? Can you pull it out of a VDI and not have it go to all that stuff comes down to, and it depends on how it's set up. But just the rule of thumb is if whoever's managing something for you on your technology or has access to your system or tools that you're using, if it's related to your CUI, it's touching that stuff, then assume it's going to be in scope. Then have conversations about that. Pull a third party in to help you with scope. We got plenty of people that have been on these webinars too that can help you with that. We can talk about that. I want to ask this question though, because this is a good one we didn't talk about. And if the answer is we're not 100% sure, that's fine too. But curious if there's an appeal process for assessment results, and there is. But Fernando, good to hear you on this one. C3POs are going to have varying levels of experience and knowledge, so there are going to be inconsistencies in how rules and solutions are implemented. What's the latest on? I disagree with what you just said.
Yep. So all the C3POs right now that are on the marketplace are authorized C3PAOs. Once the rule is final, the next thing that is going to happen is we're going to have to become at some point ISO 1720 accredited. We're going to have time-bound and an appeals process in place as part of that accreditation. Now, the way that the rule reads today, the proposed rule, the way it reads today regarding appeals, is that if the OSC disagrees with the C3PAO, then the C3PAO has to bring in somebody else that was not part of the assessment to basically review through everything that we assessed and make a determination. Yes, we agree with Fernando, or no, we agree with the OSC. If that person that we pull in decides, yeah, we still agree with Fernando, the next step up would be from there would be to escalate it to the Cyber AB, who has the final decision. And that's how it's written today in the proposed rule.
And what happens from there, nobody knows, but we're hoping more clarity on that. There's going to be a learning curve without question on how the CMMC world's going to. Phase one is the phased in, or whatever they're calling it, is some of that stuff's on purpose to make sure that things are prioritized the right way as possible. Again, maybe we'll learn more tonight on the town hall. Maybe we'll learn more in the month of October's town hall. Wish we had more information there. This is the best that we could do in 1 hour on this topic. Fernando, personal opinion here. Thank you very much for making that very clear and very relatable. Hopefully we're able to answer. I know we didn't get through every question, but we can answer those when we're done and get those sent out. That's everything from our side. ATI, thank you again for allowing us to spend time on this topic, and kick it back over to you guys to wrap. Possibly not. Yeah, there we go, Chad. Okay, got it.
Thanks a lot, Derek. Appreciate it. Hey, thanks a lot once again for joining. If you want to look at the previous series, there's 4 leading up to this. You can go on to the CMMC website that was provided earlier. Fernando, Derek, thanks for your joining us today, and we look forward to future discussions as we step through this learning process. We will have a 6-part webinar series, and that should be coming up next month, and we'll be rolling out more information here for the October date within the next few days. So thanks a lot, everybody. Greatly appreciate it, and we will talk to you soon.
Signing
Thank you.
off.
Thank you, everyone.